Okay, folks, welcome to another Wings of Kentucky. This month, we're going to be talking about invasive birds. We're going to talk a little bit about invasive birds that are found across the United States, but we're going to focus mostly on species that we have, of course, here in Kentucky. Now, today is just going to be an introduction to what invasive birds we have and a little bit about their basic ecology and some of the damage they can do, but we're not going to have time to talk about anything related to control. Or mitigating the damage they cause. That will be a different Wings of Kentucky episode. So today we're going to just focus on a brief introduction to the invasive bird species of Eastern North America and Kentucky. So before we get into that, it's important to think, what is an invasive species? Now, we talk about this a fair bit on From the Woods today, but invasive species are usually a non-native organism. Now, a somewhat contentious concept is the idea of a native invasive species, and that's a topic that's debated quite a bit, whether an invasive species or a native species can be invasive. I would argue that they can. But by and large, a proper definition of an invasive species is a species that outcompetes or otherwise harms other resident species, causing damage to the ecosystem. And that damage or harm component is actually critical to something being an invasive species. There are certainly non-native organisms, and we're thinking about birds today, that are not invasive. And of course, there are native species that behave in an invasive sort of way, as in causing damage or harm to an ecosystem, usually because they've become somehow out of balance with the broader ecosystem. So a sort of amusing example of this would be the Canada goose. This is a video that kind of was making the rounds on YouTube at one point. And you can see this guy just trying to get into his office at work, and he is fighting this goose like a knight slaying a dragon. It's actually quite amusing watching him swat at the goose with his newspaper. It goes on for a long time. The goose gets in some pretty good licks, as you can see. Now, getting to this idea of invasive versus exotic. So exotic is a species that is from somewhere else. So synonyms for this would be non-native and also alien. Now, obviously, exotic species are native somewhere, but not all invasive species are exotic, and not all exotic species are invasive. So a fun example of an exotic species that is not particularly invasive is this here. This is a great tit, which is a very common old world species throughout Britain and other parts of Europe. And we actually have a small exotic population of them in eastern Wisconsin. This is records from iNaturalist, where great tits have been introduced. They don't really seem to spread outside that area in eastern Wisconsin. There's no evidence to suggest that they're particularly outcompeting our native birds or introducing diseases. So that would be an example of an exotic species that is not particularly invasive. And it's important to recognize that most exotic species don't take hold and become invasive. So oftentimes in ecology, we use this 10% rule when we think about invasive species. About 10% of introduced species survive and stay in an area, and about 10% of those, or 1% of the original number, become invasive. What about the survivors that are not invasive? That would be species like coltsfoot or the Hungarian partridge that persist and maybe even spread to some extent, but don't cause widespread ecological damage, and we call those organisms naturalized. So, what are some exotic bird species in North America and Kentucky more broadly? I mean, a fun one that I always like to introduce people to is the ringneck pheasant. A lot of people don't realize that this bird is not native to North America. It is a Eurasian pheasant. Again, the ringneck pheasant is the damage it causes to other birds is somewhat debated, but it's certainly not native. So we've got a wide variety of invasive birds across North America. We've got a lot of species in warm places like California and Florida, a lot of parrots, for example, that don't tend to spread or be invasive. We have a lot of game birds like the Hungarian partridge and ringneck pheasant that are spread across various parts of North America that may or may not be invasive. And we have a handful of invading species that are actively spreading, like the Eurasian collared dove, and even some that are declining, like the house sparrow. So there's the Eurasian collared dove, and there's the chucker, which is an old world galliform that has been introduced widely to North America. Doesn't seem to be causing at least widespread ecological harm. Monk parakeet, that's another one. That's actually a very interesting one. It's a very cold hardy introduced parrot. There are large populations of them in places like downtown Chicago and New York City. And for whatever reason, they proliferate in those environments, but don't seem to spread beyond them too much. So let's talk about some individual species. The rock dove, or the feral domestic pigeon, this is a very well-known species. It was actually the first domesticated bird on Earth. It was domesticated about 10,000 years ago. Bear in mind that the chicken was only domesticated about 5,000 years ago. So the pigeon has been domesticated for a very long time. And these are some the fancy domesticated type pigeons, but they mostly look like this in the wild. This is sort of the wild type feral pigeon. And then, of course, they readily demonstrate this mutation here that's called Czech. This one is often in the bird keeping world is called a blue bar phenotype. This Czech phenotype is also very common, at least in part due to domestic breeding. But they are kept for all different kinds of things. There are pigeon breeds that are bred for meat. They get really huge and are tasty. Birds for show, like something like this. This, I believe, is an Indian fantail. Its primary purpose is to look pretty. Birds kept for racing, like homing pigeons, and messaging, of course. And as you might expect, these birds have become feral across North America, and you might release pigeons that look like this. It doesn't take very many generations before they start looking much more like this, because these birds here with these goofy crops or air sacs or whatever they have, these very unusual features, curled feathers, natural selection gets rid of that really quickly. And any of their babies that lack that trait, they immediately get a huge advantage, and those weird traits are frequently lost pretty quickly in the wild. And of course, they're known to cause at least some amount of problems, mostly in agricultural and urban places due to their presence of their droppings, their nesting activities, etc. And again, these are those two main color morphs we tend to see in feral pigeon populations. The next is the mute swan, introduced from Eurasia in the 19th century. It's a beautiful bird. The male and female look almost identical. They mate for life. They hold up their wings in this very elegant way. The problem is they're highly aggressive. They're famous for attacking our native waterfowl. There's a record of one guy actually being drowned by one in a kayak. They're known to destroy the nests of native birds like loons, and now there's an increased effort to manage mute swan populations with shotguns in the winter in places like Michigan. House sparrow. This might be the one we're most familiar with, to be honest. It was introduced in 1851 to the cage bird trade and quickly spread across the United States. And we've got the male here, the female. I mean, I'm here at Cooper Building on UK's campus, and there's probably 50 outside my window right now. They nest in cavities. So the thing that makes that interesting is they'll take over the cavities of other birds. So here's a cliff swallow nest, and a male house sparrow is poking his head out of there. They'll compete with bluebirds and other birds for nest cavity access, and they can be quite aggressive in their pursuit of a nest site, outcompeting native species. Crazy thing about them is they're rare and declining in their native range of Europe. And actually, this is a North American Breeding Bird Survey map showing the trend of house sparrows across the United States in different areas. And red and orange areas are places where house sparrows are declining, and the various blue and cyan are places where they're increasing. And yellow is like roughly stable. You can see that populations of house sparrows across the United States are actually declining. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's certainly interesting. European starling, another nasty cavity nester, introduced in 1890 by a group of folks who wanted to release all of Shakespeare's birds in Central Park, meaning any bird that was ever mentioned in one of Shakespeare's plays, they wanted to release it into Central Park. And even back in 1890, we didn't have a super good idea on what happens when you introduce an exotic organism into a new place. Well, the European starling quickly spread across North America. It's another cavity nester, and like the house sparrow, they'll outcompete other birds for access to cavities. So here's a starling kicking a red-bellied woodpecker out of a nest, and you can see a adult starling here feeding a nestling that's probably very close to fledging the nest. Eurasian collared dove. This is a very interesting one here in the bluegrass region. I'm obviously in Lexington right now, and the collared dove is fairly uncommon in Lexington. But if you go south to the outer bluegrass region, so like Richmond, Nicholasville, areas like that, the species becomes much more common. And I actually am not sure why that is, but it does seem to be a fairly consistent pattern. It was introduced about 30 to 40 years ago, probably from the pet trade, and has spread very rapidly. So here's the range in 2000, pretty, a few birds around, but not widespread. And then the collared dove in 2015, 10 years after that, you can imagine it is much more widespread even than that. Started in Florida in about 1980 and now all the way into Alaska. And studies have looked at the Eurasian collared dove and whether it affects our native birds like the mourning dove, and it doesn't really seem to. So as far as we know, it's not a particularly invasive bird, but it's obviously not a native bird. The last one we're going to talk about here is not this poor little chipping sparrow, but this big beefy guy. This is a fledgling brown-headed cowbird. And this is a bird that's kind of native. It's definitely native to North America, but it's not super native to Kentucky. And you're like, McNeil, what are you talking about? How can something be not super native? It probably occurred in Kentucky naturally to some extent. But we have changed the landscape in that we have fragmented our forests, we have opened up the landscape a lot more, and we have a lot more cows and open pastures and things that brown-headed cowbirds really like. And now the species is way, way, way more common than it ever was. And it was never found extensively in the East. So in some regards, it's considered an invasive species. Now, bear in mind that it's a native bird to North America, so it's still protected by federal law, but it probably was never common in eastern forested landscapes anyway. So it's a brood parasite, which is one of the big problems. So it's a species that lays its eggs in the nests of other birds, and it basically cons those birds into raising its young. The female here, rather drab, plain bird. The male is where the species gets its name. So it's got this iridescent plumage. It's a blackbird. So these blackbirds tend to have very dark, but also iridescent plumage and a matte brown head. So it's a well-named bird, I would say. And they're called a cowbird because they like to follow bison, and today they follow cows. Again, they like to occur in these highly fragmented landscapes, and deforestation and fragmentation of forested places has allowed the eastward spread of the brown-headed cowbird. So that is a very brief introduction to some of our exotic birds that we have here in Kentucky. We'll look forward to talking to you next time for our April Wings of Kentucky. And in the meantime, when you're out birding, keep an eye out for some of those exotic birds. Thanks for joining, and I will look forward to next month.